You are watching The Chorus in the Chaos podcast, relevant and reformed thinking, by bringing a biblical worldview and a Christ-centered focus to the conversation.
Well, hello and welcome to The Chorus in the Chaos. My name is Blake and I am flying solo tonight. Jack and Grayson were not able to join. We are just in a crazy season of life right now. It seems like when somebody's got something going on, the other guys are free, and when they're free, somebody else has got something going on. So hopefully soon we will be back together and be able to finish off these 10 commandments. Tonight we are moving to commandment number 6. Thou shalt not murder. Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. As we've moved through this series, we've talked about several things. We've had some spicy moments in the buildup of of the commandment series. Myself and Jack and Grayson not disagreeing on some things, but then kind of disagreeing on how we approach other aspects of the 10 Commandments, which always makes it kind of fun. I guess that is the chaos in the chorus there. But when you get to the 6th commandment, you shall not murder, this is pretty much a universally understood, at least on the surface, commandment. Whether you are a Christian or a non-Christian, most people would assent to the fact that murder is not good to do. In fact, a society that allows murder quickly dissolves into all kinds of horribleness. And we'll kind of uncover some different things regarding that. But as we look at this command, Exodus chapter 20, verse 13, a fun fact for you that you can impress your friends with, coworkers, folks sitting next to you at church, is this is actually the shortest command in the 10 Commandments. In fact, in the Hebrew, it is only 2 words, and it's literally not murder. It seems like a basic command. It seems like a universal command. Ask 100 out of 100 people why murdering is wrong, and they will answer you because it is. We, though, as Christians, dear listener, actually have an answer as to why. Why is murder wrong? Now, so many things in today's society are going to hinge on this answer. Of course, the thing that comes readily to our mind is when we think about things like abortion. Why does it matter that these babies are being murdered in the womb, in the most sacred place, where they should be the most protected? Well, of course, as Christians, we understand that each and every human being is valuable. They're valuable not simply because of what they potentially can contribute to society. They are not valuable because of their size or because of their location or their intelligence level, but they are valuable because they are made in the image of God. And we see this, of course, in Genesis 1:26 through 27. There are several ways. Well, I should say there's several things that this means, to be made in the image of God. A couple of them would include that mankind has eternity in their hearts, that it is mankind that longs for a life after this one. That is something that is placed in us by God. Furthermore, the human being is a physical and spiritual creature. Because God is spirit, those who worship must worship in spirit and in truth. And we have the capacity as spiritual beings to commune with our Creator. We do need to make a clarification at this point. Because in a world that confuses human beings for animals, and animals for human beings. This is something we quite often get flack for on the page, is when we say, for example, that pets are not your children, because pets are not children, and men are not mere animals either. And so as we look at this, we have to consider, well, what is the difference between a man and a human? Because that makes or a man and an animal, rather, because that makes all of the difference when it comes to this command that we shall not murder. Now, another clarification then that needs to be made is not only the distinction between man and animals, which is pretty obvious from Scripture, but we need to clarify our terms, because sometimes we get sloppy with our language and we'll say something like, well, the Sixth Commandment is thou shalt not kill. It rolls off the tongue nicer than thou shalt not murder. But thou shalt not kill is not the command. The command is against murdering, and there is a distinction between murder and killing. We might say that murder is unlawful killing. That is, that murder is the intentional and the unjustified taking of a human life. Therefore, to physically murder someone, to take their life in an intentional and unjustified manner, is a sin. To murder a baby in the womb, to intentionally and in an unjustified way take that baby's life, this is murder and it is a sin. Killing, however, though murder involves killing, killing is not always unlawful and it is not always a sin. For example, we do kill animals. So the distinction between animals and humans is important here. Furthermore, killing can be lawful and it can be justified. The Bible acknowledges lots and lots of situations where killing is not considered murder, it's considered something else. For example, self-defense. This is something that we've talked about before in our one of our Q&A series a couple seasons ago. Which, by the way, if you're listening to this, we just hit 100 podcast episodes, which is just amazing. I count it a privilege to be able to spend this time with Jack and with Grayson, both just incredibly godly men, and have been just a personal joy for me to be able to do this podcast with them. So I'll throw that little compliment in for them and see if they actually end up listening to this episode or not. But self-defense is killing that is both justified and lawful. Exodus 22:2 allows for the killing of a thief, for example, that breaks into your home at night. And if you struggle with this thief and he dies, you are not guilty. Another example we have in Scripture is capital punishment. Genesis 9:6 with the Noahic covenant. Romans 13:4 talks about the sword being carried by the government, that the government has the right, and not only the right, the responsibility to execute justice, and that there are capital crimes, that when they are committed, it is the role of the government, the duty of the government, to take that person's life, to get them through the court system, take their life, and push them on to the higher court where they will stand before God for what they've done. There is, of course, warfare, which we see throughout Scripture. God commands Israel to engage in battles all over the place. Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 1 and 4 through 4 is one of those instances. Of course, we get into the realm of what is a justified war and an unjust war. We will, maybe at a different time, kind of unfold that. That's probably a whole episode in and of itself. But we also have in this commandment, not only thou shalt not murder, don't take someone's life intentionally and unjustly, but there is also that we have seen with these commands, we've talked about this, that's brought out particularly well in Watson's book on the Ten Commandments. Kevin DeYoung, which was an extraordinary help preparing this outline. That there is implied positive duties for the commands. The commands are not simply things you're not supposed to be doing, but there's implied things you are supposed to be doing. And so a basic implied duty of this command would be the responsibility for the Christian to preserve our own life and the life of others. And so not only are we not taking life, but we have a duty to the best of our ability and in a godly fashion, preserve our own life and the life of others. So the command itself, and that's kind of all introduction. The command itself, you shall not murder. One of the things that Watson brings out in his Ten Commandments, which I thought was particularly helpful, was that there are several kinds of murder. Of course, there's murder of the body, which is what we regularly think about. But there is also, that Watson brings out, a carelessness of the other individual's name. And here's what he means by that. And I think he makes a good point, particularly in the case of slander. If you slander someone and you bring false accusations on them or spread false things about them, that can severely damage that individual's reputation unjustly. In fact, it may even, if the slander is strong enough, prevent them from being able to work, prevent them from being able to provide for their family. They may even be outcast because of this slander. Well, that individual, their person, is as good as murdered when all of these things are taken from them, their ability to provide for themselves and to work and do those sorts of things. This is, of course, one of the heart issues that comes about. And of course, Christ will talk about this later, and we will look at that as well. But there's also the murder of the body, which, as I mentioned, is the thing that readily comes to mind. In Scripture, there is no concession for those that killed purposely. There were those who killed by accident. There were sanctuary cities and things of the like. But for those who killed purposely, there was no sanctuary city. We also see in Scripture that the physical murder, that there are so many things that lead up to physical murder. Physical murder is the fruit of so many roots of sin that exist in an individual's life. Scripture mentions many of the sins that lead to physical murder. Anger, for example, is one of them. In Genesis 49:6, as Jacob is blessing, he speaks of his two sons, that they are murderous, that their anger has caused them to murder other individuals. We see in Scripture examples of jealousy and envy being reasons that someone will begin murdering. Of course, we see this in Satan himself, but think about Joseph's brothers. Joseph's brothers, as they become jealous of Joseph and the favoritism that is shown toward him, they are so consumed with envy and bitterness that they finally devise the plan: let's get rid of this guy by killing him. Paul, the apostle, in Galatians 5:21, he actually puts anger and jealousy and envy, he puts all of these together in the same category, again, of things that lead to murder. Proverbs 27:4 tells us that wrath is cruel, anger is overwhelming, but who can stand before jealousy? To murder breaks both tables of the law. To be jealous and envious is to be discontent with God, and then it ends with injuring a man. A prime example of this is Cain. Cain's sacrifice is not honored by God, and so in anger toward God, discontent with God, and anger toward his brother Abel, Cain commits what we know in Scripture as the first physical murder. Hatred is another one that just leads to this outpouring of sin that culminates in the taking of a life. Thomas Watson said that hatred is vermin that lives upon blood. Haman hated Mordecai. And though he had so much going for him, though he had so much things going well, it was his hatred for Mordecai that got him up in the morning. It was his hatred for Mordecai that ultimately is his very downfall. What are some ways that murder is committed? These things are brought out more fully in Watson. Again, I would really recommend Thomas Watson's 10 Commandments. If you haven't ordered it yet, I think we've talked about it every single episode. Very good, very approachable for a Puritan. Watson, I believe, is one of the most approachable to read. What are some ways that murder is committed? Well, physically, of course, literal murder. There's murder of the heart. Matthew chapter 5, Jesus talks about that murder begins in the heart, that if you've hated your brother, you've already committed murder. In the positive sense of this, of course, is we're not called to hate our enemies, but rather we're called to pray for our enemies. We murder with word and with deed. Think about the Jews at Christ's crucifixion, or Christ's hearing, rather. The Jews murdered the Lord of life with false accusations. They murdered the Lord of life by crying out, "Crucify him." And though they didn't put their hand to it, their voice and their heart is that which was used to, of course, push Pilate into that decision. Murder is committed by the pen. David sends Uriah to the front lines. And the instruction is to have the other soldiers draw back so that Uriah will be killed. And in this ironic twist, the fateful Uriah takes his own death sentence in a letter to the battle, where he loses his life. David doesn't unsheath the sword and kill Uriah in that moment, but he does so by the force of his pen. In fact, when he's confronted with it later, the blame is squarely put on David's shoulders. We murder by plotting and organizing another's murder. Prime example of this, of course, is Jezebel. What an unpopular biblical baby name, by the by. Jezebel having Naboth killed. Again, from envy and wanting his property. But she plotted and she organized for this to happen and brought it about. And he's killed. We murder by using some kind of a neutral means. Think about this. That it's not the poison that murders. It's not the car that murders. It's not the gun that murders. It is the fault of the man with the murderous intent. And so these neutral means that are used, they are used for murder, but again, this springs out of the heart. This is why things like gun control it does not make sense. It does not make sense because it doesn't change the hearts of men. And men are so wicked, in fact, that if you were to take every gun off of the face of the earth, they would begin murdering each other with other instruments. In countries where there are guns banned, only the criminals have guns, and people are still being murdered. Something to think about, my fellow Americans. We murder by not preventing the death of another when it is in our power. And here's one you probably don't think about too often. But I think we have a prime example of this with Pilate. Pilate, after examining Jesus, comes before the Jews in Luke 23:4 and says, "I find no fault in him." Pilate has the power right then and there to say, "I'm letting him go. I find no fault in him. Be gone. Go bug somebody else." But he chooses not to do that. Though he is warned by his wife, though he knows intuitively that Jesus is innocent, he has the means to prevent the death of Christ. He has the power to prevent the death of Christ, and he doesn't. So this command isn't as cut and dry as it seems on the surface. What does the commandment not forbid? This is a question we should probably ask because we've talked a lot about what it does forbid. What are some things that this commandment does not forbid? Well, as we mentioned, governmental justice, the death penalty. It does forbid private revenge. Again, we're not to take private revenge for ourselves. We're not supposed to Batman it, but rather leave it to the government and to the justice system that we have in place. You'll remember that even when somebody was executed in Israel, that it wasn't an individual bringing this about, but rather it was the society of Israel. It was the people of Israel as a group that would do the stoning. Just war is not forbidden in this commandment. Self-defense is not forbidden in this commandment, which we talked about already, of course. One of the things that, if we're not careful, we will look at this commandment and we'll think, well, I haven't murdered anybody physically, so I'm good to go. This one seems pretty simple. But there's lots of applications in our society that have an awful lot to do with us and the decision making that we bring about. In his book, The 10 Commandments, Kevin DeYoung, he talks about murder in popular culture, and he brings out a couple of points that I think are worth echoing in this episode. That the Sixth Commandment, for example, it prohibits self-murder. It prohibits suicide. When you talk about suicide, what a painful subject matter for those that have gone through it, those who have been left wondering. Those who have been left wondering, well, was there something I could have done? I should have seen it. I should have this, that, and the other. So full of what ifs and what abouts that even bringing up suicide is incredibly painful for many. But we must remember, brothers and sisters, that suicide is a sin. It's not an unpardonable sin, but it is a sin. DeYoung says in his book that this is not a pastoral care strategy, but it is just doctrinal foundation. So if I was dealing with somebody who was suffering from the effects of someone else committing suicide, I wouldn't just immediately run to, well, suicide's a sin and they were wrong for doing that. This is just, we're talking doctrinally here. The examples of suicide that we have in Scripture, there's only 5 instances that we have of suicide, and all of which are tied to shame and defeat, which is interesting. Even when someone like Jonah or Job try to spiritualize the desire to die by asking God to kill them, God looks at it unfavorably. When we think about suicide, though, societally, we have this unhelpful pattern of removing moral accountability from the person that commits suicide. And we almost excuse it and say things like, well, we all have our demons. We all have our struggles. We don't know exactly what was going on in their mind. The reality is that God never brings us into a situation where violating his law is the only way out. And so when we say that suicide is not the answer, we mean suicide is not the answer, not only for all of the tertiary reasons, but for the primary reason that it is a sin. And God calls us to preserve life and to lean on him and to run to him in our times of affliction, in our times of shame, in our times of sorrow. Of course, another area of murder in popular culture, which we mentioned earlier, I say we because Jack and Grayson are with me here in spirit, but the issue of abortion. Psalm 139:13. For you formed me in my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. Life begins at conception. Elizabeth, Mary's cousin, recognizes the child in the womb, in her womb and in Mary's womb. The scientific fact of the matter is that little baby upon conception is whole and distinct and living. That there's no missing parts, that little baby is not going to become something else. All it's going to do is develop from everything that is already there. This is kind of a little side rabbit trail kind of thing. If you would really like to dive into how to intelligently speak about abortion and spiritually speak about abortion and be able to answer some of these pro-abort, pro-murder individuals, I cannot recommend to you enough a YouTube series called Life is Best. Life is Best is, I think, written and directed by a man named Scott Klusendorf. This came out quite a while ago, actually. I think it's probably been 15 years ago, maybe. You can find them for free on YouTube. Life is Best, episode 1, Scott Klusendorf. That'll get you there. Fantastic resource for training individuals to speak against abortion. Can't recommend it enough. Finish this episode and then go check that out. I think you'll find it helpful. Again, I think episode 1 can be found on YouTube for free. Abortion, prohibition of self-murder, of course, suicide. How about the issue of euthanasia? I live in Oregon. Oregon was the first state to legalize euthanasia. This is a big problem. There's a lot of problems, not just moral problems, but there's a lot of legal problems and medical problems that bubble up on this subject of euthanasia. Because, for example, many instances of euthanasia, like the family is not required to be notified. It's not specified in most states what kind of doctor must diagnose you before you are euthanized. And when we say euthanize, we're really just speaking about the legal movement of suicide. I know in Oregon you can pick up your drug from the pharmacy and you can administer it at home. The problem is that things like the misdiagnosis of a terminal illness is a very real thing and happens more often than you would like to believe. So we've got these legal and medical kind of things, but then there's also a whole host of ethical problems that come along with this as well. You cannot seek to stop suicide. Okay, so as a society, most in society would say, we'll say something. If you need help, reach out, call a suicide hotline. Suicide's not the answer. You can't say that on this side and then on the other side promote suicide as the best answer to the struggles of your life. It's sending a mixed message and a confused message and the wrong message. Point of clarification that we are talking about something that we can't allow our understanding of compassion, what is compassionate, to get clouded. We're not talking about termination of treatment when we talk about euthanasia, but the termination of life. We're not talking about the decision to stop taking dialysis, for example, and to let the natural processes of things work out and carry you into glory. What we're talking about is the forceful, determined termination of life. A lot of people will say things like, "Well, I don't want to be on a machine," but that's not what euthanasia is about. Euthanasia is not about being on a machine. The euthanasia is about killing you. There's lots of unexpected consequences, I think, when we talk about euthanasia. The Netherlands, for example, was the first country to legalize euthanasia. And it has been around long enough now in the Netherlands that insurance companies won't treat certain things or attempt to treat certain things and will push for, you guessed it, euthanasia, suicide, self-murder. It's so much cheaper and gets people moving through the system quicker. Another unintended consequence, speaking of the Netherlands, is, do you know who, in these terminal cases, do you know who is requesting the most assisted suicide in the Netherlands? It's not the patient. It is the family of the patient. During Nazi occupation of the Netherlands, Dutch physicians refused to obey orders to let elderly and terminally ill people die. Kevin DeYoung says in his book, it took one generation to transform a war crime into an act of compassion. Brothers and sisters, Scripture tells us in Psalm 41:1, blessed are those who have regard for the weak. The Christian is not pro-euthanasia. The Christian is not pro-abortion. The Christian is not pro-suicide. We are pro-life in all of its senses and forms. Well, we can't end a podcast episode on not murdering, the Sixth Commandment, without talking about Christ. So again, in Matthew chapter 5, the great Sermon on the Mount, the greatest sermon ever preached, Christ begins talking about the issues of the heart. And in Matthew 5:21 through 26, he makes it clear that this command is not just about the physical act of murder, but the violent, emotional sins, rage, bitterness, unjust anger that feed into this fruit of the physical act. And then he spins it with not only the prohibition and the intensifying, which we've talked about, how Jesus intensifies or at least shines a light on what had already been part of the command, the heart issue. And he puts a positive twist on it, that we are to love our enemies, not hate our enemies, but to love our enemies and to pray for the persecutor. What an incredible way to go to war with our own sinful hearts. What a way to shut down bitterness and anger and malice and rage and jealousy. But by loving our enemies and praying for those who persecute us. Is it enough, then, that we do not kill our neighbor in any such way, the Catechism asks? And the answer is no. When God condemns envy, hatred, and anger, he commands us to love our neighbors as ourselves, to show patience, peace, gentleness, mercy, and friendliness toward him, to protect him from harm as much as we can, and to do good even to our enemies. My name is Blake. This has been The Chorus in the Chaos. I'll see you next time.